Look
Okay.
at that.
Okay.
Hey,
We are live.
we are live. I'm still a little confused. We haven't been live in a while.
We haven't been live in a while. Calling Chris Anderson. And where are you?
I am in the new Studio W1 in Windsor.
Studio W1. Fantastic.
Yeah.
Fantastic. I think this is the outdoor camera there shows and is that someone from the royal family in that?
It is. Well, that's the footman. She's bringing me the invitation. Chuck and Camilla are going to have us over for a casserole and hot pot.
You've got some explaining to do if you're calling her a footman. And then I got another picture here. I got the inside of the new studio. Oh, yeah. There, look at all those books.
I know that. And those are just my temporary. But I want to be clear. Those are my temporary bookcases. I'm getting custom built ones. So that's only about like a quarter of my books. So, but yeah, they're out of boxes. That's good.
Well, you're in a fantastic location at your new house, Studio W1. That's fantastic. Yeah. It looks good.
And where are you? Because I'm getting a sense of fuchsia. I don't know.
I am on the good ship Crystal Serenity on a 2-week cruise where I am one of the speakers. And I shot this video a little bit ago. And so when I was out there, one of the things I did is I made a snowball because it snowed.
Well, I want you to be like in the bow, leaning forward with your arms outstretched.
There is actually a place you can do that. I will try to get that picture later on. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for sitting through all of this, and welcome to History Happy Hour. Thanks to Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours for helping to bring you this show. Check out their rich offering of military history tours at stephenambrosetours.com. And look, whether you're watching live, replay, whether you're listening on the HHH podcast. We are glad you're here, and you can join us by becoming a top shelf patron if you want to, and we're glad for all those people who have. And today we're going to be taking a look at the Plantagenet Kings of England. I don't get to say the word Plantagenet very often, but I did just there. So we have a great show coming up. We're in 2 locations that neither of us have ever done a show from before. Are you ready to get started?
I am. You ready? Okay.
I think there's something familiar we can do. Go ahead.
There we go.
Hey, the bar is open, but Chris, we forgot to see who's here. So can you tell me who's watching?
Again, yes, Miss Hammer from Wigan, and great, Ken Hattrup from Kansas, Mark Strack from Wisconsin, Homer Hodge from the Old Dominion.
Oh, hi, Homer.
All on the Old Dominion.
Andres, I see. Yeah, fantastic. Wally Morrison, and excellent group of people there. So, guys, Kathy Hurst in Providence. I'm somehow not surprised. Between 1199 and 1399, English politics was high drama. You had civil war, pandemic, murder of kings, execution of rebel lords, and yet from out of this period develops the English state that would become one of the leading nations in the world. And our guests to talk about that today are 2 Cambridge historians, Dr. Caroline Burt and Richard Partington, who are the authors of the new book, Arise England, 6 Kings in the Making of the English State. Dr. Burt is a medieval historian and college lecturer at Pembroke College, Cambridge, and Mr. Partington is a senior tutor at St. John's College, Cambridge. Guys, welcome to History Happy Hour.
Thank you for having us. It's great to be here.
Hi, thanks for having us. Good to see you on the high seas, Rick.
And Caroline wanted me to tell everybody, Chris, that Gloria Gaynor is performing.
Get out.
Cruise. So
are you going to be able to stay through the whole show? You're not going to.
I'm going to be watching the show, and maybe we'll shoot a little interview with her, bring it on next week. But dream on, yeah. Did you guys bring a cocktail today?
We did.
Mine's a foamy ale.
Okay.
To be fair, when you asked us on, I have to say, Rick, I was afraid and I was petrified, to be honest. But I think I'm going to survive the interview.
Mm.
My
Oh, a little Gloria Gaynor reference there.
Yes, look at this.
All right, I will survive.
Sorry, viewers.
So you guys, if I had Caroline as like my medieval history teacher, it would have gone a lot more smoothly. I'll tell you what.
Is it the gin or is it the?
No. It's the
attitude.
repartee. Yeah.
Your book is entitled Arise England, which suggests that the period it deals with is critical in the creation of the English state as we know it. Why does this period matter, and why did you decide to write about it?
Caroline, would you like to start or should I?
No, I think you should take it away, Richard.
Okay. Well, Caroline and I have been teaching separately and together this period of English history, British history for a long time, for a couple of decades, and it's the period on which we both research, and I guess partly thinking about the history ourselves, teaching it and talking to one another, we just became more and more focused upon how critical this period was for the formation of key building blocks of the English state, which remains really important in ordinary people's lives today, but which also, because of the British Empire, was exported all around the world, including obviously to the United States. And it's that sequence of key developments that I think is so important. And now, none of this is to say that there would have been an English state without this period in particular, or that other periods weren't also important for the development of the state, because clearly they were. There was something akin to a state, even in Anglo-Saxon England. But in this sequence between 1199 and 1399, critical things came into being. Just before our period, in 1166, the common law was created, a single legal system for the entire country, for everyone, accessible by ordinary people. And in fact, 95% of the legal cases were peasants and townspeople using the law to protect themselves and further their own interests. So a legal system for everyone, extraordinary within the context of medieval Europe, and not really echoed anywhere else for many centuries. And once you had that legal system applicable to everyone, questions began to be asked about the applicability of the law to government. And that, through political crisis, and Caroline will talk about this, I'm sure, during the next hour, led in 1215 to the promulgation of Magna Carta, the Great Charter of Liberties, which placed government under the law. And once government had to obey the law, the ways in which government had raised money for war, for international conflict, had to change. And so that led to the development of national taxation, which had to be approved, which led to the development of Parliament. And then the combination of national taxation and Parliament together allowed a much more sophisticated and effective professionalized military to emerge. And right across this period, partly through Parliament and partly through the growth of the law and the extent to which the law in particular involved so many people in government, we saw a shift in which government in 1199 had been essentially the private business of the king. By the middle of the 14th century, 150 years later, it was a public business. And in the late 1350s, the great King Edward III, about to sign, he hoped, a peace treaty with the French to end the first phase of the 100 Years' War, consulted with Parliament and asked Parliament's view on foreign policy. The idea that the king would ask Parliament what he should do about his foreign policy 150 years earlier would have just been ridiculous. So an extraordinary shift, and those key blocks of the modern world for us in England and in the wider world: a single legal system, national taxation, Parliament, representation, and the public ownership of government. So it was the consciousness of that kind of overarching story, underpinned by the really vivid and dynamic histories of politics and political leadership in each of the individual reigns, and the great contrast there that I think drove us to write the book.
So, but is it this legal system, which you say in the book is unique in that it's independent? Is that kind of the seed corn for this whole thing? Because obviously, at that time, all these countries in Europe, they have violence, they have kings, they have nobles, they have war. But it's this legal system that seems to be where everything is sort of springing from. So is that the baseline? And if it is, why does England, or I guess what we call it now, why do they have it and nobody else does?
So I think you've got a couple of things going on. A big part of it is the legal system, and that creates in itself a shift in mentalities. So that when King John is taking very large amounts of money from his subjects, particularly from the most important subjects, the richest subjects, the barons, there is an increasing sense amongst them of every time he says, well, you know, if you don't do this, I will take your lands from you. There's this increasing sense of, well, hang on a minute, I can't do that to anyone else. And if I try to do that to my tenants, they can go and appeal to the king's law against me. So why can he do it? So it creates a shift in mentality because it makes the unfairness of that system, it brings that into very, very sharp focus, and shows that, you know, there is a group of people who cannot do anything in the face of the king's behavior when everyone else can do something in the face of their behavior. So I think that's one element of it. I think you also have to kind of go back and say, well, why was it possible for England to have a legal system that centralized in the first place? And some of that was just the kind of the luck of the way England had developed historically. You know, it was, as Richard mentioned, much more centralized and unified than quite a lot of countries in Europe, let's say, for example. And that meant that the king could do much more in practice than kings could in lots of other countries. So it was possible to envisage having a legal system like that, and for it actually to mean something to somebody, you know, who's in, let's say, Shropshire, when most of government is at this stage already happening much more in the southeast and in London. And so those two things go together. And I think, again, the centralization also enables the king to have access to people's resources in a way that in lots of countries the king could not have dreamed of. So when you put all of those things together, the king's able to take much more from lots more people in England right across the country than kings in other countries could. And you've got a legal system that is showing up the inequalities of that to people and throwing it all into very sharp relief. So I think it all comes together.
So
Chris,
go ahead.
If I may, Chris, you did ask, where did it come from, in the sense, why this legal system? Part of it was about a response on the part of King Henry II, the first Plantagenet king, to the so-called anarchy of Stephen and Matilda, the preceding period. And he really sought to take control of his realm in two ways. One was through the creation of a single legal system, and the other was through the building of castles and the acquisition of physical apparatus of power. And I'm sure that when he created the common law, he did not envisage the way that it would grow. It grew like topsy, and it grew so fast because suddenly there was a legal system that was impartial and professional and underpinned by royal government, that was accessible to ordinary people, and they wanted it. They could access it, and they wanted it. And the drive from below, I think, across time was much more important than the drive from above. There were times when great kings like Edward I drove the common law from above, but all the time there was more and more demand from below.
Yeah. And I was going to ask this question much later, but I'll ask it now. Does this development of the common law, this kind of leads to lawyers, right? As we know them. When does that start becoming a thing, and how many seconds after it becomes a thing do people start criticizing the lawyers?
Oh, I mean, very quickly. So initially you have attorneys, so people who would represent you, but actually it's in the 13th century that you get the start of a legal profession. And by the time we get to the late 13th century, you very much got a legal profession, and you start to have a lot of questions being raised about which you would expect about other things that lawyers could do in their time that might represent conflicts of interest, or which would put them in a position where they were favouring one interest over another. And so you start to have regulation about what lawyers can and can't do, and investigations into judicial corruption as well on the part of judges from the 13th century really onwards. So yeah, people are immediately questioning what the lawyers are up to and what the judges are up to.
I mean, show me a trial at any point in history where the losing side doesn't say, well, actually, I don't think the judge played it completely fairly.
Right.
This is an ancient
but Caroline is
tradition.
there are certainly questions about judicial probity and effectiveness, but I think now we would say that these were overwhelmingly the completely natural growth pains of something that had emerged from nothing. And of course, it takes time for professionalization to produce a kind of code of practice that everybody follows. And actually, it happens in this period. By the time you get towards the end of our period, the great concerns about judicial corruption have essentially disappeared. Now, that's not to say that individuals weren't concerned about the fair operation of the law, because, as I suggested earlier, there are always going to be people, particularly on the losing side, who will raise questions about whether the system has treated them well. But once legislation is in place, actually, a professional expectation is there. Everything really calms down, and but we don't really know exactly when the legal profession has, as such, developed. It's brilliant work by Paul Brand on this, of course, but we know when the Inns of Court, the great legal training houses, were in place, but they weren't in place until the later 14th century, and we suspect there was a kind of incremental process from the mid 13th century onwards, in which there was lots of training that was conducted kind of collectively, and the hostels in which the trainee lawyers were lodging together began to form into colleges of learning, much in the same way that the colleges of the universities of Oxford and Cambridge emerged out of mutual residence and support among the students.
So Richard, when you pick up the book at the store and you start to flip through it, you talk about these 6 monarchs. They're there on the cover. The book is divided into each of these reigns, and there could be a tendency to go, okay, this is another great men of history version of history, and it's not. And when you had answered my last question, you made a really interesting point that it's kind of obviously the monarchs have a key role in all this, but there's lots of pressure from the bottom for this change to happen.
Yeah.
So kind of opening the floor here to give you guys a chance to explain that this isn't just another great men of history book, and that there's more going on.
I mean, the story of the Kings is really dynamic and engaging, and we're also very interested in political leadership, not just the political leadership of monarchs, but the political leaderships of all of the major political actors in the political community. So there's an important story there too. And of course, history unfolds in real time. Causation unfolds in real time. You have to look at what was going on in the politics to understand how things happened. But to step back from that, Chris, I think Carol and I would both say that what we're really interested in is the interface between ideology, the ideas, concepts like sovereignty, the idea of the emperor, the king as emperor within his kingdom, ideology combining with circumstances, what was going on in politics nationally and internationally, combining with the role of key political leaders. So it's that interface of ideology, circumstance, and individual agency that produces causation. And I think one of the things that I certainly was really struck by in writing the book was that I think probably Caroline and I weren't consciously downplaying individual agency in causation, but we were very interested in ideology and political circumstances. And I'm a great believer in circumstances binding the hands of political actors. I think that a lot of the time, political actors have very little choice. But for all that, when we looked at how key developments in statehood emerged, we kept seeing the role of the individual. And that's not to say that the state was generated by great men. It absolutely wasn't.
Right.
But things like Edward I and Edward III could drive state growth because they could see the potential of government, because they worked hard, and because they wanted to harness the realm and its resources to the national interest. Whereas kings like Edward II or Richard II presided over periods of much less state growth, because the only thing that was really driving the state at that point was the demand from below, or broader circumstances. There wasn't the political leader saying, here is an opportunity.
So then there's more of a vacuum then too, right, for that person.
Correct.
Right.
A vacuum is the right word, Chris. Thank you.
So kind of awkward coming off that question, but what I wanted to do was ask you guys about the 6 kings. So okay, it's not great man history, but that is kind of how the book is organized, and I suspect that a lot of our audience probably is only very slightly familiar with all of these guys. So could you run through this list in order and give us a sentence or an accomplishment or a thought on
and
each
there are some
one?
great sentences on some of these guys.
Yeah.
and I know that so Caroline, maybe you can do the first 3, and Richard, you can do the second 3. So why don't we do it that way?
Okay, so King John is, I suppose, tyrannical rogue would be a really good way of looking at King John. He's not without ability. He's not without drive and determination, but he makes enemies all of the time, needlessly in many cases. And unfortunately for John, he's the architect of the loss of the most of the lands that belonged to the Angevin Empire that he'd inherited from his father, Henry II. And of course, he's the person who brought about Magna Carta through the political crisis that he generated. So tyrannical rogue would be a good start.
Can I just jump in there as well, Carolyn, just to emphasize to everyone, John, he was a very bad man. Sorry.
Got it. Very bad man. Okay.
Yeah. When we describe some of the very bad things that he did in his reign in the book, so hopefully that provides some frisson of excitement. Henry III, so 56 years on the throne, and he's in certain respects the most enigmatic, I think, of our kings. I still find it difficult to know what drove Henry. What are the words that come to mind when I'm thinking about Henry? A nice man. I mean, he's ever such a nice man. He's a great father, and he's a great husband, and he's just a terrible king. He tries, and he has ideas, and he really does, but it goes so horribly wrong. So that's Henry. And then his son, Edward I, I don't really know what the genetic link was between Edward I and Henry III, though Henry was a notably faithful husband. So I'm sure that the genetic link was there, but they're very, very different personalities. Edward's a man of business. He's a warrior. Henry didn't really like fighting. Edward is very much up for fighting, so much so that he goes into battle with broken ribs. So I guess an inflexible man of business, because Edward sees things in very kind of black and white terms, very kind of straightforward terms, and finds it at times. I mean, sometimes he's pragmatic, but actually at key moments, he cannot be pragmatic because he's so affected by his beliefs about royal authority. He's so driven by those beliefs. So he's a mixture of amazing success and some spectacular failures of political judgment. So really, really interesting character, and a very strong character.
And to my mind, somebody for whom ideology was enormously important. Ideas were really important. And that's one of the things I think that trammels him a bit. He wasn't the only king, of course, to be thinking about sovereignty and masterfulness and the power of his own rule. This was absolutely in the atmosphere in the time of his rule. But he was somebody who was perhaps temperamentally particularly susceptible to taking those ideas to their logical conclusion, when good politics would have said, back off a little bit. And then
yeah.
Oh, sorry, Rick. No, please.
No, go ahead. You've got 3 more to go.
So Edward II. I mean, if we don't know how Edward I was the son of Henry III, how Edward II was the son of Edward I is even harder to fathom. He was a man of extraordinary selfishness, irresponsibility, idleness, and later in his reign in particular, cruelty. But even in his youth, he showed signs of cruelty. He was singularly ill-fitted to be a political leader, and the disaster of his reign sprang almost wholly from his own really poor, really self-interested political decision-making. An extraordinarily depressing king to write about it, actually. And then in another extraordinary shift, Edward III, perhaps the political genius of the period, a king of amazing personal ability, really, a man who combined cognitive intelligence with emotional intelligence, huge capacity for hard work, a very strong common touch, very good political instincts. He could be very driven and ruthless. He could be extremely demanding, but he was also very capable of admitting errors publicly, of shifting his position in the face of political argument, and of accommodating others. And he presided over a period of amazing state growth. Parallel to that, actually, in the reign of Edward I, and he idolized his grandfather, Edward I. And lots of the things that Edward III did really well were things that Edward I had begun, but which Edward III somehow took to the logical conclusion. And he was somebody who I think was underestimated by historians for a very, very long time. He was enormously highly rated in his own lifetime and in the centuries immediately afterwards. And then particularly in the 19th and 20th centuries began to be seen as a kind of political failure, extraordinarily an amazing act of political anachronism and deafness, really. But an outstanding political leader, an outstanding king, and in many ways an outstanding person. And then finally, Richard II, again, another shift. And the history is all about patterns and discontinuities. And we keep emphasizing these patterns of difference. Richard II, who was the grandson of Edward III, was another king whose reign was disastrous. Like Edward II, he was very self-focused and also failed to apply himself to the business of government when he needed to. But unlike Edward, he seems to have had political ideas. It's just that the ideas were completely wrong-headed. He seems not to have been able to understand that as king, he had extraordinary power through his public authority, and that power could be exercised almost without limit if he was focused relentlessly upon the common good. But instead, he understood power as a physical matter. He wanted to make himself the greatest of great lords, and he didn't understand that would undermine his impartiality and his unique position as king. He became tyrannical towards the end of his reign, and his deposition, like that of Edward II in the early part of the 14th century, was as close to inevitable as one can get.
So one of my favorite books is by a man named Geoffrey Parrott, and it's called A Country Made by War, and it's all about the impact of warfare on America becoming America and taking the direction it does. And as I was reading this book, that was sort of speaking to me in the back of my head. And obviously, conflict and war is a big part of what creates the state. So could you touch on the importance of that in this whole process?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. And one of the kind of most important sets of circumstances, if you like, that we discussed in the book was war and its impact on the state. So if John had not needed to defend the honor of an empire in France against the French king, Philip Augustus, he wouldn't have needed the money he needed. He wouldn't have needed to place the pressure on England that he placed on England. And kind of the rest is history. I mean, this is all the backdrop to Magna Carta, and the failure of John's master plan for getting everything back in 1214 is what gave rise to political crisis in England, as people said, well, you know, look, you failed now, and this can't go on any longer, so we're going to have to draw some lines about when you can have access to money. And really, in a way, Parliament comes into being because it's the forum in which the king asks for money for war, which he has to do after Magna Carta, because if he doesn't ask, there'll be another political crisis, because feeling is running so high. So Parliament is, in the first incarnation, all about war taxation. You know, taxation isn't something that goes out of your pay packet every month like now. Taxation is what you call extraordinary. It's not routine. And if the king wants it, he's got to justify why he needs it. And the thing that he needs it for is war. That's the most costly thing. So there becomes then a dialogue about which wars people are willing financially to support. And that happens in Parliament. So as time goes on, you find that actually this state is not just about the king and what he wants. It's about the dialogue between the king and his subjects about what's in the best interests of England, the common good of England in terms of defence of its lands overseas and, of course, its own borders within the British Isles. So it drives a huge amount of the story that we tell in these 2 centuries, for sure.
And war picks up again, particularly in the late 13th century from 1294, and then, of course, with the 100 Years' War, which really begins in the mid-1330s, but formally begins in 1337. And there's no question that one of the motivators for Edward III, perhaps the key motivator for Edward III in driving state growth, is to be able to fight better. Yeah. And so war is, if we had to identify a single engine of state growth, other than perhaps ideology, I think it would probably be war.
Okay, cool. And can I just pick up on that? One of the things that I was also very curious about, I know obviously the book is we're talking about England here, but why do you think it is that, say, obviously France, because I want to talk more about France later, why aren't they picking up on this idea and saying, okay, the English can do this efficiently. They're now a professional army, which I was really startled to read about, that an actual professional army, which is a first. So I was curious as to why, England is marching in this direction that they're going, and nobody else seems to be developing in the same way or picking up on the same ideas, or kind of.
The French king is really trying.
Is he?
Okay. Yeah, particularly under the Capetian dynasty. They are really trying. The thing you have to remember about France is you've got a number of extremely powerful dukedoms, and one of whom actually is in Aquitaine, who happens to be the English king.
Yeah.
And these are people who will not cede their authority to the French king to do things like collect revenue, and judicial authority as well. Now, if you go back to England, after the Norman conquest, what you don't have is very large areas of land in very discrete geographical areas that are under one lord. And so you've by definition got lordship that exists, but it's much more broken up in terms of its geographical reach. And that's very, very different from what the French king has in France, no matter how hard he tries. And quite a lot of the time, it's very difficult for French kings to express their own authority in any really meaningful way beyond the Ile-de-France. So, the area around Paris.
Yeah.
And that's just an absolutely core difference between the two countries. Now, even despite that, and I'm sure Richard will say a bit more about this, because France is so much bigger than England and has so much more wealth to tap, one of the reasons why the French king can be so formidable an enemy for the English king in France, and also attacking the south coast of England, for example, is because even without the same sort of centralized authority as the English king, the French king has access to so many resources. The difficulty the French king has, of course, is dukes all over the place, not just in France, but in bits of what are now, what's now the Netherlands, for example, Belgium, where the French king is trying to claim authority, and where the counts or dukes are actually allying with the English against the French king in order to retain their own independence. And that's where it becomes very difficult for the French king, because he's always kind of fighting alliances between, let's say in particular, the English king and some of those people, whenever he's trying to get something done.
Yeah, I have to say, oh, go ahead, Richard.
Well, I was going to say that in a way, Caroline, I think, as she always does, hit the nail on the head. The French kings perhaps don't make the changes that the English make because they don't need to in the same way. They don't have that same urgent need. Remember that the English, if you think about the great reforms of Edward III, the extraordinary transformation of English arms, so that the English became the dominant military force in Europe, that was driven in lots of ways by their defeat in the face of Robert Bruce and the Scots at Bannockburn in 1314. They learned hard lessons, and they adapted to fight in a new way, partly because of those hard lessons, and partly because they could not hope to match the French in conventional terms. They had to do it differently. There are some mysteries, though. I mean, why was it that the French never developed longbow archery in the way that the English did? They had the same weapon. The longbow existed everywhere, but they didn't produce mass archery, this extraordinary artillery weapon, in the way that the English did, and we don't really know why. One of the most fascinating things to me about the period is that there were great political leaders, people like Edward III, people like Geoffrey de Charny in France, people like Henry of Grosmont, the first Duke of Lancaster, who wrote extensively, who commented on all sorts of things, on chivalry, on faith, on dimensions of politics, all of whom were heavily involved in military reform, generalship, international relations, and they never wrote about those things. So they write about everything but military change at a time of extraordinary military change. It's really
I was just going to say, we shouldn't overplay it as well. I mean, there are ways in which there were things that French kings did that the English kings copied. So some of the kind of great inquiries that took place late in Henry III's reign, and particularly in Edward I's reign, they got the inspiration for that from Louis IX of France. So it's not that the French kings weren't doing anything at all. I mean, I wouldn't like to paint that picture, but it's just a very, very different setting.
Yeah.
So one of the things that's a big factor in this book is the Magna Carta. And King John signs the Magna Carta in 1215 and immediately tries to run away from it as fast as he can. And so how does this become such a foundation document of English and, frankly, of American justice if the king who signed it didn't think it was worth the paper it was written on? What is it about the Magna Carta that makes it stand the test of time?
It quickly becomes talismanic in political dialogue, and I think that's a crucial thing to it becomes talismanic in dialogue. Yeah, I think that's the thing to kind of first of all appreciate. So yeah, John does not want Magna Carta. I mean, Magna Carta is going to place restrictions on the king, and particularly on King John, that he absolutely does not believe should be in existence. And actually, for that matter, nor does Pope Innocent III, who supports John, because Pope Innocent III is immediately thinking, whoa, I don't want this either, because, the logical corollary of this is I'm going to face something like this. So no, it's not something that John wants. The problem is that there are enough barons who, when John rejects this, are willing to fight for it because they have no choice. They know what John's going to do to them, that you end up with a civil war. So you have some barons fighting for John, but you have a good body of barons who are fighting against in the name of Magna Carta. Then what happens? John dies in the middle of the Civil War. Very inconvenient for John, particularly since the child he leaves the son he leaves is a child, and there has to be a regency government. Now that government comes to power in civil war and has to end that civil war. Well, yes, they win the military battle, but as we all know, military battles are not the end of it. You've got to reach a political settlement, and they realise that, and realise that actually to move forward, they were going to need to confirm Magna Carta, because this was just not going to go away. It's not going to go away if you don't confirm it. You're going to face political crisis on political crisis on political crisis. So that government, I think, realizes this very quickly and accepts it. So by the time Henry III becomes a man, this is a kind of done deal. Everyone is we've moved on from this. The king should be beneath the law, and that's that. Henry tries a couple of times to kind of act differently and sort of go against Magna Carta, to some extent, not really consciously. That's what I said earlier about Henry, is just at points a little bit clueless, and he faces very, very strong backlash for that. So it just becomes the case that if you're a king, unless you're really stupid, you don't provoke on this issue. You want some money for war, go and ask people, reach an agreement, get the money by their consent, because the alternative is political crisis. And so Henry III's reign, he ends up provoking a big political crisis in the 1250s, and it ends up in another civil war. And I think by the time Edward I comes to the throne, he's saying, look, I get this. I get what we need to do. I get how this needs to work. And people, the political community kind of moves on and says, yeah, this is done. So it's hard for kings to resist it, because in practice, while they can, in theory, while they can, in practice, they can't really.
And it seems to me that it's an absolutely natural instinct, a universal, that the people who govern you should be constrained by rules, that they can't just do what they like, because by definition, a king who does what he likes in his own interests is a tyrant, not a king. And Magna Carta in the end is protection against tyranny. Now, we all know, of course, that politics can drive things differently, and politics in the end is always the guarantee, the protector. But I have to say, I mean, without wanting to get into the politics of this, when the Supreme Court in the United States decided that presidential acts were not justiciable recently, I really found myself conscious of how monumental this decision potentially was, having Magna Carta so vividly in my mind. We've had 800 years of government being under the law.
Richard, I always appreciate it when historians point out the fact that history does actually matter, and you need to pay attention to it. And so thanks for that plug. We had a question from one of our viewers that either of you can take this up, but this is from Wally Morrison, and since we've been talking a lot about ideas and progression, he wants to know, how were ideas effectively communicated in those days, given the lack of education among so many and the lack of ways to communicate those ideas? So how is this transition happening or getting out to be?
I love that question.
It's a great question. Really Thank you, Wally.
So a couple of things I would say, and I'm sure Richard will say a few other things. When kings are trying to get messages across to their subjects, quite often they'll have them literally read out in town squares, and sometimes they'll be read in the pulpit. So you'd be surprised how quickly instructions, ideas, arguments get conveyed to people in the localities. The king has got on hand in the localities a sheriff, a very familiar term in America, I know. So the sheriffs were great legal officers of the king, and administrative officers of the king. So they would often be charged with conveying all of this stuff. In terms of the kind of big ideas, so you've got a university network in Europe, particularly Paris, Oxford, for example, Bologna, all of those are places where lots of ideas are developing. You've also got the church, which is where there is a huge amount of intellectual capital. So, for example, Thomas Aquinas, a very famous scholastic theologian who had wrote a lot about the common good, which came very heavily into English politics in this period, was at the French court in Paris in the mid-13th century. Probably Edward I at least heard of him there, may even have met him there. So ideas were being conveyed through churchmen, through kings, royal courts. And what strikes me is quite how much dialogue there was across the great courts and the Church of Europe in this period.
I think the other thing as well, and you know more about this than I do, Caroline, is that literacy levels were higher than you might suppose. But Caroline is right. I mean, the other thing I think, you know, we've already touched on within another context, England's small. You can get an idea from one end of England to the other end of England in 4 days without any difficulty at all. So news literally travels fast. If
you think about the United States, think about how many time zones you've got. We have one time zone. You know, we are a small place.
I mean, you know, how quickly could things happen? In the mid-14th century, the king could issue an order at Westminster for pirates to be arrested in the town of Bristol, 150 miles away. A group could set off that day to arrest the pirates, arrive there in Bristol that night, arrest the pirates overnight, set off back with the pirates to Westminster the following day, have them back in front of the king effectively within 48 hours. You know, they had good roads, they had very good networks of support and administration. Government was thoroughgoing and far-reaching. So ideas could spread easily, actually.
And actually, one of the things we talk about in the book is the first major peasant rebellion in English history, which was in 1381, when peasants from particularly Kent and Essex, but other areas of the home counties in the east of England, all marched on London. And it was pretty brutal. So, you know, people like the Chancellor, the Lord Chancellor, and Treasurer got murdered, and their heads
Chief Justice
put on spikes above the River Thames. The Duke of Lancaster had his palace, the Savoy, which is, I think, where the Savoy Hotel now stands, was burnt to the ground. So, you know, ideas about what government was doing and governmental corruption and problems in government were spreading and to these peasants, you know, these revolting peasants who came to London and, you know, actually ended up going into a dialogue with Richard II himself in a field. Which is quite interesting. So those ideas were communicated to people. They were getting out there, you know, to ordinary people, to the poorest people in lots of ways.
And the legal process was also part of this. If you think about the common law but also things that stood outside the common law, like the county court, several times in every county, often in several different towns within the county, there would be judicial sessions, assizes, the delivery of jails, that's criminal trials, visitations later of the justices of the peace or justices of oyer and termina, justices of inquiry. All of these proceeded via juries, multiple juries, grand juries, presenting juries, and of course trial juries. And so the level of representation of ordinary people in government through the operation of the law was actually quite extensive. So even if you yourself were not directly involved in the operation of government through the operation of the law, you would almost certainly know somebody quite close to you who was. And of course, people talk. So so there was, I think, it's Chris Dyer, a great historian, who estimated, I think I'm correct in saying, that maybe 40% of male householders by the mid-14th century had some sort of role in government. Wow. I mean, it's an extraordinarily high figure, and the common law is a critical part of that.
Well, and another critical part is Parliament. This is when Parliament comes into being, and I love this. At the beginning of your story, in 1199, it doesn't exist. At the end of your story, in 1399, it plays a part in deposing a king and ratifying a new king. So how does this come about? and is there a king that is particularly responsible for making it happen, or is it all coming up from underneath? You know, there is this one great image of, I'm just trying to get it in and use the image of Edward I with Parliament, but is he a responsible person for Parliament, or is it something that is organic and comes from the people and just happens?
Edward I is undoubtedly a key player. So Parliament comes into being in Henry III's reign. It's Edward who realizes that he needs to engage in really constructive dialogue with Parliament, and that if that dialogue can happen, this can be an immensely powerful and symbiotic relationship, and he gets that. So Edward says, yeah, you know what, I'm not just going to listen to Parliament, I'm going to call more representatives to it. So we'll have routinely, we'll have the Knights of the Shire in Parliament, not just the Lords. We'll have people representing the towns in Parliament. And he would go to Parliament, he would say, look, you know, I want to fight this war against, you know, the Welsh Prince or in Scotland. Will you give me some taxation for it? And there'd be a whole dialogue around that. And by the way, while you're here, if you've got any grievances or any petitions, you're having any particular problems, just bring them on. So he was really, really good at developing Parliament as something that could work with the king rather than simply work as a check on the king's freedom to do things. And suddenly he found that he harnessed the power of the realm and the wealth of the realm to the English crown. And so I think, you know, that's a big moment for sure. I think, Richard, you probably want to say a little bit about Edward III, because again, that's another key period.
Well, I think with Edward III, like so many things, he really takes his cue from Edward I, and he does more of the same things. In the interim, during the reign of Edward II, there has been the regularization of parliamentary process, and this is the kind of, you know, the momentum, Rick, that you were referring to. And institutions do, as you rightly imply, develop momentum and start to have coherence and logic of their own. But Edward III, like Edward I, really sees the point of Parliament and embraces it. And you end up with this extraordinary situation, which you see in the surviving parliamentary rolls, by the time you get particularly to the 1350s, where within Parliament, the king consciously pays tribute to the people and their representatives and everything that they've done for the realm, and they thank him for being the greatest of great lords. It's almost as if they're kind of looking at one another and performing a kind of genuflection, but it's absolutely mutual and universal, and embracing of the potential of the community to the realm's purposes.
So as I read the book, you know, there's a lot there, and I know we're bouncing around quite a bit, but I'm getting towards the end of it, and I've been happily enjoying reading about this period of 200 years, which I didn't know as much about as I thought I did. And I'm reading about this, and I'm learning so much. And just towards the end, you say the parallels between 1272 to 1307 and 1939 to 1945 are striking. And it just caused me to come completely up short, because I spend most of my time studying the Second World War. So that statement was not something I expected from two medieval historians. So maybe you could expand on that a little bit, and maybe, you know, why did you say that? What are those parallels, and how are they so striking?
I mean, it goes back to what we said earlier, Chris, about war being such an important driver. About, in a way, war demanding that the state grow. If you think about so many dimensions of state growth in the UK in that immediate post-war period in the 20th century, so much of the spade work for that was done during the Second World War. Even things like, the great 1944 Education Act, nationalisation, so many dimensions of managed economy were things that war demanded, and to which the English state, the British state, responded. And it's the same in the late 13th and parts of the 14th centuries, that there is almost no choice but to push government further and faster than ever before, because this is the only way that you can respond to national emergency. And it's really easy for us to forget that what was going on in the late 13th and the early 14th centuries for the English, particularly in relation to the French, was national emergency. The 100 Years' War didn't happen because the English kings fancied having more of France. The 100 Years' War happened because the French state was expanding towards its natural borders. The English were the victims of that. And because there was a kind of existential crisis. And because the French, flexing their political muscles, were supporting the Scots, who were England's enemies internally within the British Isles, and attacking the south coast of England. There are moments in the late 13th, 14th centuries that feel very much akin to the Napoleonic Wars or the Second World War. I mean, you can make far too much of history always repeating itself. It never repeats itself exactly, right. But there are patterns that you see, and there are universals that extend beyond the obvious universals of psychology. The role of the individual and the human experience to patterns of international relations and national politics.
I think
so.
Also,
I think we saw those resonances quite a lot, didn't we, Caroline?
Yeah, I think also when I was writing about the 1370s and 1380s, you've got a huge economic crash in the 1370s that follows on from the worst pandemic that medieval Europe has ever seen in the Black Death. And I think about what happened in 2008 with the economic crisis. And then, of course, we had COVID. We've had a growth of suspicion of elite and government and the idea that everything must be corrupt, because why else are things going so horribly wrong? And of course, sometimes there is corruption. But I think it really resonated with me. You have the Peasant Rebellion in 1381, angry at how government has failed people and how poor people have become because of the crisis, and that existential feeling of, however people reacted to COVID, lots of people died and it turned our worlds upside down. And there's that sense of the world never quite being the same again. And you see all of that in the 1370s and 80s. And it was actually writing about it. It was particularly writing about it during COVID was quite an eye-opener for me in terms of those sorts of enduring patterns that we see.
So, okay, we're running short on time, and I guess I'm going to get the last question here. And I also am going to base a question off of a quote, and mine's not nearly as serious as Chris's was. I will warn you in advance. It's actually on page 220 of your book, and I ran into the following two sentences, and I'm going to put them up on your screen. The following day, Llewellyn ap Gruffydd Mailer, who had been so provoked by the constable of Ostwestry Castle, launched an attack on the castle. Then the princelings of De Hubert seized the castles of... You go ahead. Three castles. Aberystwyth, Llanmediffi, and Carrigkennen. And I mean, come on, guys. Only the most dedicated, nerdy academics in the world can write a sentence like that. Is this an Easter egg that you put in the book to make sure that we had read it?
I'm still struggling to recover from that.
I'm getting no response.
It's what one has to deal with, the geography that one has to deal with, and
you did well.
England's small. Wales is even smaller.
Well, okay, we'll leave it at that. We want to thank today our guests, Dr. Carolyn Burt and Richard Partington, the authors of Six Kings and the Making of the English State. And yes, there's a little bit of Wales in there as well. Guys, thank you so much for joining us today and for having us.
It's been a real pleasure.
It's been great fun.
Thank you for hosting us. We've really enjoyed it. We hope
we survived.
People listening have enjoyed it too.
Hey.
I've almost finished my beer.
See, there you go. You timed that perfectly.
Yeah. Oh,
thank
so
you
much.
very much. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Okay.
Good luck with everything.
See, okay. All right. We got it. Okay. I read that sentence and I was like, come on.
And you got to use it. I mean, No, but
I
did you
didn't
practice
have
it before you
I
read it out? Did you?
should have. I that's why I put it in type so that people could go back and look at it and study it and understand. You know, if you're a Cambridge academic, you have to learn to spell. Apparently, I just assume those things are spelled correctly.
Well, I was gonna.
I know Richard and Carolyn, you can still hear us, so I understand that you're listening to me.
Well,
But
I'm gonna put Doreen in touch with Caroline, because when Caroline was talking about some of the schleppy kings of England, all I could think about was Doreen saying, "Oh, bless his heart." So I think Caroline should use that in her classes to explain how ineffective these people were.
Okay. Well, so this year, Chris, this episode, this year, I don't know, whatever. We covered 200 years of British history. Next week, we cover 1,000 years of Native American history.
No
With
problem.
Kathleen Duvall, who's the author of the book Native Nations. Come on, Rick. A millennia in North America, millennium in North America. So you know how the Native nations had cities and city states and all this stuff that was largely reduced by the time the Anglo settlers came and the Spanish settlers came, but there was some of it still left, and we're going to get into all that next week. Yeah. So guys, please subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Facebook, shout at us on X, listen to our podcast, back us on Patreon, and if you like, browse at historyhappyhour.com.
Thanks, everybody. Be safe.
Oh, I have to play the, I am,
Come on.
come on, right? Okay.